Hi, I'm Joan Marshall, Director of the Bryan Museum. I want to welcome you here today as we launch our first talk in a series exploring African American contributions to Texas history. The idea for the series really came out of the response we got from exhibiting Ted Ellis's painting in June of this year called Free at Last. And the public response was so interesting and enthusiastic that we thought we would explore more African American history and the contributions that have been so significant. So Sam is here today to launch that series. I want to welcome you. Thank you for being here. Sam's been a longtime member, supporter, part of our Delegado board, and also is born on the island. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here with you at the Bryan Museum in Galveston, Texas. In 2018, the #1 movie in the country was Black Panther, and everyone wanted to go to Wakanda forever. Just recently, Chadwick Boseman transitioned. He brought that character to life, and everybody needs a superhero. But when I think about superheroes and individuals with superpowers, this story of Professor J.R. Gibson is a story of a superhero from a real place called Galveston, Texas. And it's a real story of service and commitment to the community. So this hidden history of Texas, we're going to start this journey in this first inaugural presentation on Professor J.R. Gibson, who's buried actually in Hitchcock, which, even though I'm born on the island, I have ties to Hitchcock, the big city.
Well, I'm curious, Sam, why do you think Professor Gibson isn't more well known?
Well, one of the things that in society, unfortunately, we've been culturally conditioned to undervalue the contributions of certain individuals. And in this moment, in this movement, in this time, more of these stories are beginning to surface, stories of African Americans' contributions all throughout the country, but specifically here in Texas, in Galveston, there are many individuals. Of course, everybody knows the Galveston giant, Jack Johnson. But what they don't know is Jack Johnson was a student of Professor J.R. Gibson. And now, in an article that I will reference, Professor Gibson said he didn't teach him how to fight. But he was a student there. He didn't graduate from Central, but both of his parents were working there, and we'll get to that in the story as we dig deeper into this story of this amazing individual and his family. So one of the things, while I was walking through a cemetery in Hitchcock, I ran across the headstone of John R. Gibson, and it said, died December 15th, 1948. First principal of Central High School, the first Negro high school in Texas. And when I read those words, I was just amazed that he was buried there in Hitchcock at Bainland Memorial Cemetery. And I had heard Professor Gibson's name, saw his picture over at Old Central because they had his picture in the old library, Old Central Cultural Center on 27th and M there. But the fact that this information was on that headstone piqued my curiosity a little bit more. So buried in Hitchcock was not only the remains of this individual, but I feel the story of his amazing contribution. So from that headstone, I said, if he died December 15th, there had to be an obituary. So we, with the assistance of Sharon Gillens, who helped with my PowerPoint presentation, she's a fabulous researcher. The newspaper article, December 13th, 1948. So there was not anything on the 16th or 17th with regards to an obituary. I would have thought if he died on the 15th, then there must be something on the 16th or 17th announcing his death. Well, when we backed up a few days, we found out that he actually died on December 12th and not December 15th. So while these historic resources and cemeteries are valuable starting points, sometimes the information is not absolutely accurate, but you can go back, and we found this newspaper article, and on the front page of the Galveston Daily News, December 13, 1948, Island Negro educator dies, John R. Gibson, 83, also was a diplomat. So in the article, when I read through the article, it talked about all of his accomplishments, that he was the founder and principal of Central High School. He was a counselor general in Monrovia, Liberia, a longtime member of Reedy Chapel, a 32nd degree Mason, past worthy patron of the Royal Arch and a Shriner, president of Relief Association for Establishment of Old Folks Home, the organizer of the Negro Division of the Boy Scouts, founder and president of the Colored Teachers City Association of Galveston, and more importantly, he was a husband, a father, and a citizen and mentor to others. So December 15th, that date is the day his funeral, his funeral was actually December 15th at 2 o'clock. So that's how that date ended up getting in. So from that article, I also did a search online at Ancestry.com, and Sharon has taught me how to do this, where you see the death certificate. Mm-hmm. So she put the death certificate in the PowerPoint you could see, and on the death certificate, there's so much important information there. It has that he was a widow. It has his mother and father's name, which is important to the family research, Nimrod Gibson and Helen Smith, and that he was born in Virginia, and it has on it April 1st, 1865. So this is amazing. But also at the top, how long had he lived at his residence? 63 years. So in 1948, he had been there 63 years, meaning he had been at that home since 1885.
Where did he live?
On Broadway, 919 Avenue J is what they had at the time. They didn't call it Broadway. And the amazing thing about that, we just had the anniversary of the 1900 storm, September 8th, 120 years. Professor Gibson and his family survived that storm. It is just amazing that he survived that storm. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the debris line, I watched a special on it the other day, people that were behind it were spared, where a lot of people on the other side of that line, their homes and their lives were destroyed. Mm-hmm. So the fact that he was living on Broadway, had he been living closer toward the beach side, he and his family may not have survived. So we have this amazing story because he survived that 1900 storm, and he was called upon to help rebuild Galveston at that time, like many other individuals. So his daughter, Grace Gibson, was a home ec teacher at Central. I found out she is the informant on the death certificate, and that's a great deal of information. So when you're doing your family research, you want to look through these records. It's important. So now that we have his date of death, and we saw that he was principal and retired in 1936 from the article, I went back and Sharon found Saturday, May 30th, 1936 article that's titled "Friend to Man, Guiding Motive of Negro Principal Here Who Has Served School 50 Years." On his wall, he had a poem, or part of a poem, that said, "Let me live in a house by the side of the road and be a friend to man." So Professor Gibson's office, he was being interviewed upon his retirement by Joe Webb. So what's so important about this article is that this is direct quotes from Professor Gibson. And in the article, he talks about his life, and he talks about Jack Johnson and other students and individuals that he had professional relationships with. And then he mentions that he moved to Ohio when he was 11 years old in that article. So when we look back for the records, now that we know that he was in Ohio, we could look for census records, and we can look for that data. And you can draw more information from that. So when you go back to the 1870 census, according to the newspaper, the first newspaper article, he was 83. But when you go back to the 1870 census, you find out he was 16 years old. So instead of being 83, when Professor Gibson passed away, he was actually 94. He was actually older, 11 years older than we anticipated. So here was an individual from 1854 to 1948.
It's not just women who want to conceal their age.
Right, right. Well, with the 1900 storm and the destruction of so many records, I guess you could take a decade off. You could be younger. So here, this is an amazing piece of information, because what it tells us, even with the April 1st date, 1865, you think he was born before the end of the Civil War in Virginia. But shortly thereafter, you have emancipation and Juneteenth here in Texas. But when you go back further to 1854, that means him and his parents were enslaved individuals. And in the article, he said they moved to Ohio when he was 11. So they moved to Ohio in 1865. And then in 1870, his dad is listed at 40, his mom is listed at 38, and he's listed at 16. So the Gibson family lived in Greene Township, Clark County, Ohio. And when you look at 1860 records compared to 1870, in 1860, we do not believe that there were any free people of color in Virginia. So him being born in Virginia in 1860 lets us know that at that time he was an enslaved individual, but by 1870, the family had moved to Ohio, and they were free people. In 1880, he's listed at 25 years old, and depending on what month that they take the census, he may or may not have a birthday yet. So that's why, and it's not always exactly 10 years, because it all depends on who's recording the records and information. So his dad is listed at 49, and his mom looks like she's listed at 45. So to your point, she was 38 in 1870, but she's only 45 in 1880. 7 years. But so here's the family unit, but more importantly, it lists him that he's in college or in school. So he was 25 years old. They were still living in Clark County, and he was a college student attending Wilberforce University. We found that out from the article. And the thing about Wilberforce was established by the AME Church in 1856. So even before the end of the Civil War, this first private, historically black college or university, HBCU, was established in 1856. And we'll have more on that history after the program. But Professor Gibson was an 1882 graduate of Wilberforce. You'll see on the slide a photo or drawing of the university, in that he graduated in 1882. And he remained an active member of the AME Church throughout his life. And I believe he was committed to here at the Reedy African Methodist Episcopal Church, because they were his foundation from Ohio. The other thing about Professor Gibson and someone of his caliber is that he would be called on often to speak in the public, being the leader that he was. And in 1895, after Frederick Douglass passed away, he was part of a program at Reedy Chapel. This article, March 12, 1895, lists Professor Gibson and other speakers that spoke about Frederick Douglass, including Norris Wright Cuny. We also have the 1900 census. When I talked about them surviving, this census report was taken before September. So in it lists J.R. Gibson and his family. They were living at 919 Broadway. Mr. Gibson is living with his wife Addie and their 4 children. And they actually had 6 children, 4 living. It lists that they were married 14 years, but with further research, what I found is that they were married September 2nd, 1885. So they were coming up on their 15-year anniversary, but at the time of the census, they had been married 14 years. And this also lists Mr. Gibson at 51 years old. So in this instance, he's actually listed older in 1900, as though his birthday was 1849. I don't know how they did that.
Do you know why they moved to Galveston?
Well, he came down here for the opportunity to teach. He got a job teaching. Galveston being a major port city, education was important to him. And I believe that Professor Gibson committed over 50 years of his life to education, because as a former enslaved individual, he knew how important education was. So when he came here as a teacher, then later a principal at the East End School, before he became the principal at Central in 1887. And actually, through the records, I found out that he was one of the founders, and there actually was another principal before him. Yes.
Really?
Inquiring minds want to know, right? So Central was still the first high school in the state of Texas, and he was one of the founders. The first principal of Central was actually C.J. Waring, and oftentimes these individuals would be listed by their first initials, but it was in Miss Collins' book that I found that C.J. Waring, his name was Champion J. Waring. So then I was able to go to the census reports and find he and his wife, Cora, in the census report, and they got married in 1885. So I don't know what was going on in Texas in 1885, but Gibson got married in 85, Warren got married in 85. There was a lot of partying going on the island. They were not always 83. So in 1885, they were young men and their wives, and they were building their families. And shortly after that, Mr. and Miss Gibson's oldest son was born, Roscoe, then his daughter Teresa, then his daughter Grace, and John Gibson Jr. was the youngest. Now he had 6. I don't know where the other 2, where they were born in that number. His wife had 6, but only 4 lived. This picture is actually of Central in 1905 after it was rebuilt. The thing I love about this picture, these Nicholas Clayton buildings was just magnificent, right? And this high school was the show place, the African American high school. It was almost like a university.
But this wasn't the first location of Central. Where was the first?
Yeah, the first location was at 16th and L, so this was not the first location. This is at 26th and M. The first Central school only went up to the 9th grade. So they had 2 elementary schools that went up to the 4th grade, and then Central went from the 5th to the 9th. So that's the beginning of the education of the higher grades or high school. And then this 1900 storm photo shows the damage at Central High School, looking north from Ursuline Academy, showing the wrecked Negro High School. And just months after the census of 1900, which I was just speaking of, and less than a week after his anniversary, his 15th anniversary, since he was married September 2nd in 1885 to his wife Adeline, the tragic storm hits. And he was asked to serve his community at that time as a Red Cross representative. Clara Burton called upon Gibson to ensure that relief supplies were distributed to the African American community over the objections of many Galveston citizens. So we see here that there was a fight for resources, and some didn't want to share, but Gibson was called upon to help distribute. Clara Barton made sure that everybody was being helped, and that's important, that in times of tragedy that we come together. Professor Gibson also was the founder, here it says the founder and first principal, but he also served as the librarian for the colored branch of the Rosenberg Library. So it was first established in 1904 and dedicated in 1905. His annual salary was $150 as the librarian there in 1905. As I said, he was a mentor to many Galvestonians, and one of them being Jessie McGuire Dent. She was on his staff in 1922. So Jessie McGuire Dent will speak about her in November in more detail, but she was on his staff in 1922, and Miss Dent also passed away in 1948, the same year that Professor Gibson did, but she passed in March and he died in December. So these iconic figures, his heroic superheroes of Galveston, passed away in the same year. In this photo on the slide, you'll see several students. And initially, you may think that Jessie McGuire was one of the students, but if you notice, the female students are dressed similar, and also with the male students, but then Miss McGuire is dressed differently because she's a staff member by 1922. She had went to Howard University, I believe she graduated in 1913 or 14, and then she came back to Galveston and became a teacher. So other students, as I mentioned earlier, that he had, Jack Johnson, and Dudley Woodard was one of his students, and he was the dean of the math department at Howard University. So there are so many other individuals. Alan Perkins was in the first graduating class of Central, and he was one of the first attorneys, African-American attorneys in Galveston, and he was one of Professor Gibson's students. So he was an advocate for the welfare of children. This article here, Public Welfare Body Holds Discussion on Business and Schools. Professor Gibson was involved in every effort in the city aimed at improving the education and facilities for the students at Central High School. Under his leadership, Central was ranked third among the high schools in the state for African American students in this article, which I believe was 1932, October 8, 1932. He also was a fighter for equality. This article from April 12, 1932 talks about Professor Gibson being the president of the Colored Teachers City Association when they were negotiating for their pension fund. So before his 50 year of acknowledgement as principal, they honored him just being here on the island from 1882 to 1933. So the first school year would have been fall of 1882 to the spring of 1883, and in May of 1933 they were honoring him for his 50 years of service to the community.
Yeah, 50 years is an astonishing career. Who works
Who works
50
50
years
years? Yeah.
at a single institution?
And again into his 80s, because he was, 54, he would have been 79 in 33 when they were talking about this. So by 36, he was 82. Mm-hmm. In 1935, the last year of Professor Gibson's principalship at Central, there was a petition started to name Central High School Gibson High School, but it failed and they didn't do it. But why not honor an individual like this that has contributed so much to your community? I know we have Ball High School, and I understand many of the philanthropic families that donated money to help build these institutions. I believe Mr. Ball and his family committed $50,000 to the initial purchase and building of a public school, and that it would be named after him. But, there are questions around what we honor and how we remember things and how did they build that wealth to give it. But you have a person like Professor Gibson that gave his life. And I think it would have been a great honor at that time to put his name on the building. So again, we go back and we could correct the records to show his date of birth, April 1st, 1854, showing that he's 94 years old by December of 1948. And I'm not sure if his daughter knew exactly if April 1st was his birthday in 1854. But of course, with him saying he was 11 years old when his family moved in 1865, we know that he would have been born in that year, 1854, or around that time. So Professor Gibson is buried in the historic Gold Bond Memorial. It's now Mainland Memorial, but it was originally on the death certificate, Gold Bond Memorial Cemetery in Hitchcock. And despite the magnitude of his contributions to the field of education, the last photo that I want to show of Professor Gibson, the first image was kind of cloudy, but we found another image that the Rosenberg Library has, a lifetime of service to the community of Galveston. The strength in his face. He commanded respect. In his influence on the lives of thousands of Galvestonians, there is no public recognition of his tireless work in the city he called home, to which he dedicated his life's work. And I think it's time for us now to recognize John Rufus Gibson as our superhero.
I agree.
Galveston forever.
Thank you, Sam. That was great. I find it fascinating that he attended Wilberforce, the first historically black college in the country. Yes. That must have been quite a feat. How many African Americans at that time went to college? Yes,
of course, the abolitionists that were working in the North at that time helped to establish Wilberforce in 1856. And our special guest today will be President Pinkert, Dr. Pinkert, will be on to answer questions after the program and to give us the history of Wilberforce. So if you're watching and you have a question, type it in the chat, and we'll try to get to those questions. And he's going to give us about 5 minutes of the history. I was so glad that he accepted our invitation to join us because education is so important. And we need individuals, our young people, to understand the sacrifices that were made. And again, I believe that is why Professor Gibson dedicated his life to the students and to the children of Galveston, because he knew how important education was.
Thank you. Well, let's go to the question and answer.